Hello and welcome to part 2 of this set of videos on the picture of Dorian Gray. I'm Harriet Fletcher and I'm a PhD researcher in the English department at Lancaster University. My research looks at the intersections of the Gothic and celebrity from the 19th century to the present day. This means that my work focuses on ways that literary texts, particularly texts that can be described as Gothic, engage with the celebrity cultures of the time. The first video explored how Oscar Wilde's novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, can be read as a novel about celebrity. This discussion will focus down on the novel's Gothic characteristics. The session will explore the role of doubling in Oscar Wilde's novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, drawing on the Gothic theoretical idea of the uncanny. The session will develop your understanding of the Gothic tradition and introduce you to a new way of interpreting the novel's Gothic qualities based on literary theory. This detailed study of the Gothic is the kind of thing that you might do if you choose to study English literature at university. The activities in this session are designed to improve your essay skills, including close textual analysis, critical thinking, and structuring arguments. I'd like to begin this session by thinking about the Gothic tradition. Firstly, consider the following questions. What is your understanding of the Gothic? And what are some of the characteristics of Gothic literature? Take a moment to pause the video and make a list of ideas. Unpause the video when you're ready to proceed to the next slide. The first thing to mention about Gothic is that it's a term that's constantly being dissected and redefined by scholars, so there's no universal definition for it. However, the following quotations can help us get an idea of its characteristics. Gothic texts are overtly but ambiguously not rational, depicting disturbances of sanity and security, from superstitious beliefs in ghosts and demons, displays of uncontrolled passion, violent emotion, or flights of fancy, to portrayals of perversion and obsession. Moreover, if knowledge is associated with rational procedures of inquiry and understanding based on natural empirical reality, then Gothic styles disturb the borders of knowing and conjure up obscure otherworldly phenomena, or the dark arts, alchemical, arcane, and occult forms normally characterized as delusion, apparition, deception. Not tied to a natural order of things as defined by realism, Gothic flights of imagination suggest supernatural possibility, mystery, magic, wonder, and monstrosity. Gothic texts are not good in moral, aesthetic, or social terms. Their concern is with vice. Protagonists are selfish or evil. Adventures involve decadence or crime. Their effects, aesthetically and socially, are also replete with a range of negative features. Not beautiful, they display no harmony or proportion. Ill-formed, obscure, ugly, gloomy, and utterly antipathetic to effects of love, admiration, or gentle delight. Gothic texts register revulsion, abhorrence, fear, disgust, and terror. Now compare this list of characteristics to the list you came up with. Can you notice any similarities? Because Gothic texts constantly use the same conventions, you will probably find that you are familiar with many of these characteristics mentioned by Fred Botting, and you may have even written down some of the same characteristics that he describes. Now consider the following questions. Which Gothic convention do you think plays the most important role in the picture of Dorian Gray? What is the significance of this Gothic convention in the novel? Take a moment to pause the video and note down some answers. Continue to the next slide when you're ready. In answer to question 1, this really depends on your own interpretation of the text. There's no right or wrong answer here. All interpretations are valid. The key to this question is developing your own opinion, choosing one specific area to focus on, and being prepared to evidence this with extracts from the text. Question 2 is asking you to think less about what Gothic looks like, ghosts and monsters, etc., and more about what it does. You will have excellently pointed out various characteristics of Gothic text in your notes, but to push your answer even further, you could think about what these things show. For example, does monstrosity enable Wilde to say something about Victorian society? Does Dorian's evil say something about human nature? If you're presented with an essay question about Gothic at A-level or at university, the question will be asking you to not only demonstrate an understanding of Gothic conventions, but to analyse the significance of these conventions. I'd like you to keep this in mind as we progress through the video. I will now focus on a specific Gothic convention that's very useful for reading and analysing the picture of Dorian Gray, which is the double. Already, you might have some familiarity with the double and how this works in Gothic text. For example, the multiple selves in The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or the unsettling similarities between Jane and Bertha in Jane Eyre. The double can be better understood by drawing on a Gothic theoretical idea known as the uncanny. This idea comes from the early 20th century psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, whose theories have influenced the study of literary text in various ways. If you choose to study English literature at university, you will no doubt come across his work. The uncanny is a complex psychological idea that can be experienced in real life and in literary texts. It can be broadly defined as a feeling of being unsettled by something that's both familiar and unfamiliar, or a feeling of something being not quite right, like seeing a lifelike waxwork of yourself or the ghost of someone who you know is dead. Freud describes the experience of the uncanny in various Gothic ways, some of which are listed below. Something that ought to have remained secret and hidden but has come to light. Many people experience the feeling in the highest degree in relation to death and dead bodies, to the return of the dead and to spirits and ghosts. It undoubtedly belongs to all that's terrible, to all that arouses dread and creeping horror. Freud's most important observation about the uncanny concerns the double. He describes the uncanniness of the double using the following examples. Human doubles, people who are alike in some way, doubling, dividing and interchanging the self. Object doubles, things that look human but aren't, like automatons, waxworks, dolls, ghosts and the supernatural, masks and disguises. And a feeling of intellectual uncertainty, doubting whether something is a lifelike object or a real person. And this is sometimes referred to as the uncanny valley. With this information in mind, you may already be thinking of ways that the picture of Dorian Gray demonstrates uncanny moments. Perhaps the portrait as an object is quintessentially uncanny, or perhaps there is something about Dorian's relationship with it that works in uncanny ways. Or perhaps you've identified instances of doubling between certain characters in the novel. You will have an opportunity to explore some of these ideas in the rest of the video. Based on what you now know about the uncanny, consider the following questions. How would you use Freud's ideas to evidence the uncanniness of Dorian's portrait? What comparisons could you make, and which characteristics of the portrait would you draw on? Take a moment to pause the video and note down some ideas. Continue to the next slide when you're ready. Dorian's portrait operates in various uncanny ways. To evidence the portrait's uncanniness, you might write something like this. The portrait arouses dread and creeping horror as an object double of Dorian. It is a double of Dorian that's both familiar and unfamiliar. It provides a lifelike representation of him, but a representation that is also a hideous distortion. If the uncanny is something that ought to have remained secret and hidden, but has come to light, then the portrait can be described as uncanny because it reveals something that should remain a secret, the corruption of Dorian's soul. The portrait epitomizes the experience of uncanny in relation to death because its decaying state manifests Dorian's fears of aging and dying. Now compare your answers to these answers. Take a moment to reflect on what you did well and where you could improve. You might want to note down any key phrases or structural points that could help improve your essay skills. Various Gothic scholars explore what they call Gothic subjectivity, which means Gothic identity. This term is often applied to characters in Gothic texts if their sense of self disrupts the norm in some way and can be described as Gothic or working in Gothic ways. For example, Dr. Jekyll's split personalities in The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde make his identity Gothic because they disrupt our understanding of unique selfhood. In Great Expectations, the decaying bride, Miss Havisham, has a Gothic identity because she's created an existence in which she's constantly being haunted by the past. Various Gothic scholars have argued that doubling is central to Gothic subjectivity. For Robert Miles, the Gothic is a coherent code for the representation of fragmented subjectivity. Judith Halberstam argues that the picture of Dorian Gray produces a form of Gothic subjectivity because it presents the ego as multiformed, as either a series of shifting surfaces or a volume of buried depths. Both scholars regard unstable identities that are fragmented, multiple and shifting, as a key facet of Gothic texts, with doubling playing a central role in this. Now that we have a better understanding of doubling and what it means in Gothic texts, we will explore some of these ideas in the picture of Dorian Gray. The following extract is from the end of the novel and describes the moment when Dorian's body is found, which I will now read. When they entered, they found hanging upon the wall a splendid portrait of their master as they had last seen him, in all the wonder of his exquisite youth and beauty. Lying on the floor was a dead man in evening dress, with a knife in his heart. He was withered, wrinkled, and loathsome of visage. It was not until they had examined the rings that they had recognised who it was. Consider the following questions. What does this example of object doubling tell us about Dorian's identity? Which details from the extract would you use to evidence your point? Take a moment to pause the video and note down some answers. Continue to the next slide when you're ready. The extract creates a moment of doubling between Dorian's body and the portrait that disrupts expectations because Dorian cannot be recognised from his double. In this moment, Dorian's identity can be described as Gothic because it's unstable. He has lost control of his identity because it has been eclipsed by his double. Focus is immediately drawn to the exquisite youth and beauty of the portrait over the withered, wrinkled, and loathsome Dorian, because the portrait has become privileged over the subject's real-life body. Not only is Dorian's physical body unrecognisable, but it provokes revulsion. The portrait is the familiar and superior master, while the body is the anonymous dead man. Dorian is rejected in favour of his flawless double. The sheer anonymity of Dorian's corpse reveals a problem at the heart of Dorian's immortal existence. He must surrender his identity to the portrait. Now compare your answers to these answers. Which details did you choose to highlight, and how did you create meaning from these details? How effective was your analysis? Take a moment to reflect on what you did well and where you could improve. You might want to note down any key phrases or structural points that could help improve your close textual analysis skills. We will now move on to explore some examples of human doubling in the picture of Dorian Gray through the following extracts. The first describes an instance of doubling between Dorian and other young men in high society. The second is a quotation about influence from Lord Henry. I will now read both extracts. Fashion, by which what is really fantastic and becomes for a moment universal, and dandyism, which, in its own way, is an attempt to assert the absolute modernity of beauty, had, of course, their fascination for him. His mode of dressing and the particular styles that from time to time he affected had their marked influence on the young exquisites of the Mayfair balls and Pall Mall Club windows, who copied him in everything that he did and tried to reproduce the accidental charm of his graceful, though to him only half serious, fopperies. Because to influence a person is to give him one's own soul. He does not think his natural thoughts or burn with his natural passions. His virtues are not real to him. His sins, if there are such things as sins, are borrowed. He becomes an echo of someone else's music, an actor of a part that has not been written for him. Consider the following questions. What do these examples of human doubling tell us about Dorian's identity and identity within the Victorian society that Wilde depicts? Which details from the extracts would you use to evidence your points? Take a moment to pause the video and note down some answers. Return to the previous slide if you need to, then continue to the next slide when you're ready. These examples reveal the emptiness of Dorian's identity. First, Dorian's image is copied by various young men in Victorian high society. To demonstrate how others want to be like Dorian, Wilde emphasises material things like fashion and beauty. Because Dorian's image can be copied so easily and at a surface level, this suggests that his own identity is inherently blank. The more others copy Dorian's appearance, the less unique he becomes. Second, the novel establishes a chain of influence within high society that exposes the inauthenticity of the Victorian gentleman. This process of influence can be regarded as a process of Gothic doubling. Because Dorian borrows much of his fashion and personality from Lord Henry, he has lost his sense of uniqueness. He does not think his natural thoughts or burn with his natural passions. Dorian is rendered an actor whose identity is borrowed because he adopts an alternative persona, that of the Victorian gentleman. However, as Dorian's followers show, the Victorian gentleman is already a fabricated identity that can be assumed by anyone. Through doubling, the novel reveals the Victorian gentleman's Gothic subjectivity, a complete absence of unique identity. Now compare your answers to these answers. Which details did you choose to highlight, and how did you create meaning from these details? How effective was your analysis? Take a moment to reflect on what you did well and where you could improve. You might want to note down any key phrases or structural points that could help improve your close textual analysis skills. In this session, we have touched upon various examples of doubling in the picture of Dorian Gray and explored their significance. Keeping in mind everything we've covered, Which is the most significant example of doubling between characters in the picture of Dorian Gray, and why? Dorian and Lord Henry, Dorian and Basil, Dorian and Sybil, or Dorian and someone else? If you had to pick one answer, which would you choose? What key points would you make? Which extracts from the novel would you draw on to evidence your case? You may wish to explore some of the Gothic ideas raised in this session. Remember to not only demonstrate examples of doubling, but to analyse the significance of these examples. There is no right or wrong answer to this question. It all depends on what you think. I would encourage you to think outside the box and experiment with different readings. This is the sort of thing you'd be encouraged to do if you choose to study English literature at university. You can use this session as an opportunity to try out new ideas. Take a moment to pause the video and plan a response to this question. Continue to the next slide when you're ready. That brings us to the end of this session. Here are the image credits and bibliography if you'd like to do any further research. Thank you for working through this session on the picture of Dorian Gray and doubling. I hope this session has encouraged you to consider new and exciting approaches to reading the Gothic novel and has given you some helpful tips for improving your essay skills. For further information about studying English literature at Lancaster University, please visit this link.